Hi, it's Sean, and you're listening to The 3-Month Vacation. An airport is a confusing place, and yet almost nobody gets lost. As you get off the plane, you are usually jet-lagged, having endured queues of people, cramped seats, and many hours of flying. You should be in no position to make good decisions. Often enough, you are likely to be landing at an airport where you're not familiar with the layout. But you know what comes next, don't you? Somehow, despite all of that tiredness, you're able to disembark, find your luggage, declare any of that volatile stuff that you've been carrying, and make your way to the taxi stand. When getting onto the plane, the opposite sequence plays out. You already know the sequence. It's check-in, immigration, security check. Then you're on the plane. It's the sequence that allows people to go from one stage to the other and to do so very effectively. Yet this sequence is never very clear when we get to a website or when we're trying to buy something from a business. We seem to randomly pick and choose some product or service. Having gone through the activity of buying something, we don't necessarily know what comes next. We don't know what to do next. Yet this problem can be solved quite easily by understanding the concept of sequence and how to put it in place in your business or your website. In this episode, we'll look at 3 things. The first is, why are sequences more important than you think? The second is how to implement a layout of that sequence. And finally, does the sequence change or does it stay the same forever? Let's start out with the first one, which is why sequences are more important than we think. In the early days of my consulting career, I worked with a law firm that had a peculiar problem. They had several services that they would offer their clients, and it seemed logical that if the clients used them for one kind of service, they would also use them for related services. However, that was never the case. The client would use the firm for property law, but then go to another firm for trust law. This kind of client behavior confused the law firm's partners. To solve the problem, we decided to have a small event. We called clients to the event, and they had cheese and crackers and wine. And after that, we asked them why they weren't using the firm's services. The answer surprised everybody. The clients weren't using the additional services because they weren't aware of them. They were pleased with the services that they were getting from the law firm, but they saw it as a specialty firm. It was why the clients were choosing to use the competition instead. It was a simple matter of the client being unaware of what was available. Similarly, we lose a lot of our clientele because they have no idea that we offer a series of products or services. If the clients are aware, then they aren't sure where to start or what to do next. In short, we haven't defined a sequence that they could follow. Yet some organizations have had sequences in place for a very long time. And they have very precise sequences too. Take religions, for example. I grew up Catholic, and baptism is the first step in that sequence. Shortly after that, there's the First Holy Communion, then there's confirmation, and as you go through life, other rites of passage must be followed as part of the religion. This kind of sequence is likely to be true for every religion. In Hinduism, you start with the naming ceremony, the first feeding ceremony, the sacred thread ceremony, and so on. All religions tend to have some sort of pathway that enables the members of the religion to know what comes next. Equally, the religious ritual, Sunday Mass, for example, will have a series of steps. This allows the worshipper to know precisely where they are in the sequence. But you don't need to depend on religion to give you a sequence. Every time you go out to eat, that's a sequence. You settle in for your meal, you're presented with a starter, some bread, some wine, and then you progress to the main meal and finish the evening with dessert and coffee. That's a sequence. And these sequences are part of our daily rituals, allowing us to move from one stage to the other. It's also one of the reasons for having a sequence in place. Because when you have a sequence, you tell the client that you're not randomly dumping products and services on them. Instead, it sends a strong signal that you've done your homework. Instead of a client figuring out, what should I do next? What you're doing is you're charting a course for them, and they move forward from A to B, B to D, or B to J. It doesn't matter, but you're charting that progress. A sequence dispels the problem of what should I do next? There's also the hidden benefit of having a sequence in place. Usually when a client shows up, they have no idea of the extent of the journey. Since we have a pretty good understanding of where they may need to end up, we might overburden them with a complete strategy. I'll tell you what this means. Very early, as a marketing person, a client would come up to me and they would go, I need this logo, I need this marketing message. And I would say, no, what you need is this strategy. And then I'd give them this big, monstrous thing that they had to undertake. And of course, it would scare the heck out of all of them. They would run away, never come back. But if you gave them a sequence and you said, this is the journey, and what we need is just this tiny little step. And if you do this tiny little step, then you will achieve X, and we can go ahead or we can not. And then they're okay with it. And when a client can see this sequence laid out, usually on a piece of paper or on a website, it reduces the prospect of that client having to deal with everything at once. They can just focus on the tiny little bit. The earlier example was about consulting, but even if you have products, for instance, we have a course on article writing. Now, it takes several months to become a good writer. However, the prospect of spending months learning a new skill is daunting. When faced with such a difficult decision, it's much easier for the client to make no decision at all. But if you devise a sequence, they can follow through using tiny steps. And we've done that. We've shown them how they could outline an article. That's one part of the sequence. Then how to craft stories, which would be a second part of the sequence. And eventually they could get to the 3-month-long course, and they could do it online when we conduct it, or they could do it through a home study. But by creating the sequence, you're telling them what to do, which order, and you're breaking it up for them so it feels logical and doable for the client. This is how we start. This is the way you need to get a sequence going. So the first thing that any one of us should do is to figure out, do we have a sequence? What is that sequence? Because it leads naturally to the next step, which is how to implement that sequence correctly. If you were to pick up a how-to book or a booklet, you're likely to find chapters. Let's assume it's a booklet on growing tomatoes. What would the chapters look like? It may look like this: choosing the right variety, preparing the soil, providing adequate sunlight, watering techniques, fertilization, harvesting at peak ripeness. And when you look at all of these topics, they seem to follow a logical sequence. And the reason why you feel that it's a logical sequence is because it was presented to you in that manner. Because we can move things around and see whether the sequence still makes sense. Now, I know this is audio. You can't remember what was just told to you. But believe me, I mixed it up. I started out with sunlight, preparing the soil, choosing the right variety, watering techniques. So you mix things up. And when you move the elements around, they still seem logically sequenced. You could juggle all of the 6 elements, and we have just 6 elements here, and it would still be logical. Yes, some of the elements might need to go right at the top, and some of them need to be at the finish line. But in general, there is no such thing as a sequence. There is no correct sequence. When we are presented with something, we automatically assume that it's a sequence. And you can try this technique, open the table of contents of almost any instructional book, and then move the chapters around. To your surprise and delight, you will find a decent amount of flexibility when creating a sequence. Let's take one quick example from the syllabus of the Psychotactics Cartooning course. Now, this isn't the entire course, it's just the first 4 weeks. And let's see whether we can move things around. Week 1, shapes. Week 2, bears, octopus. Seagulls, hedgehogs. Week 3, cars, buses, spaceships. Week 4, perspective. You can move all of those around, can't you? So let's try with article writing. Week 1, topics. Week 2, outlining. Week 3, the first paragraph. Week 8, headlines. Yes, we jumped from week 3 to week 8, but only to highlight a certain point. You could logically start the course with topics, but you could just as easily start with headlines, couldn't you? Which is to say that most of us look at a sequence as though it's written in stone, and it's not. It's not rigid, it's not stony, it's nothing like that. You can shuffle almost anything, but you need to put it down so that a client can see what steps to take. In your business, you will have a series of products or services. These products or services can be extended or arranged to form some sort of sensible sequence. But on a secondary level, the contents of those products or services can also be moved around to create a logical syllabus. What is all this jargon about? It is to say that there is no correct way at all. If you can assemble a rough system-based sequence that seems like it's going from one end to the other, your client will happily follow along. This takes us to the third part of sequencing, the problem with having too many products and services. When you have just a few products or services, putting a sequence together is relatively easier. However, once things get complicated, what should you do? Let's find out in the next section, where we look at the reality of the changing sequence. AirPods make more money than Spotify, Twitter, Shopify, and Snapchat combined. AirPods makes a staggering revenue of almost $22 billion. But could AirPods dictate the future sequence that Apple would follow? If you were to go back a few decades, Apple was a computer company. You bought one computer, then another model, and probably some peripherals. However, at some point, that sequence seemed to change. The music software iTunes became the point of focus. The software was free. You could get it. You could manage an endless number of songs and audiobooks. But once you were hooked onto iTunes, it seemed logical to move to the iPod, which then gave way to the iPhone. Now, even if you didn't own a MacBook, and I certainly didn't, you seemed destined to follow that newly formed sequence. Each sequence also has its own spin-offs, which includes the Apple Watch or a backup device like Time Capsule. And yet, almost a decade later, it seems like the sequence has done a little hip-hop move again. While iPhones still command all the attention in the room, the sales have slowed down. The Mac, on which Apple built its business, isn't quite in the spotlight. However, AirPods continue to gallop ahead in a manner that none of us could have easily predicted. So this change in business circumstances, it is what determines the sequence. The AirPods could be the starting point that in turn could lead and increase the other products in the Apple stable. Doesn't matter if a business follows a new or older sequence. It does matter, because if the older sequence doesn't work anymore or doesn't work as effectively, then it's imperative to follow the sequence that is being determined by the behavior of the client. The client has changed their minds, or something has happened along the way, and you've noticed, oh wait, they're doing this first and then that. Now you've got to change your sequence, because technology will continuously change and will significantly affect how you create or recreate that sequence. In 2005, RSS and blogs were the road to getting clients. Today, that's not the case. Someone can start up in TikTok or start up a YouTube channel and within a few years have tens of thousands, if not millions of viewers. The channel itself forms the entry point to the sequence. The revenue from YouTube or sponsors may be all that you need to keep going. But even under these circumstances, people will send you to the website because they want you to be part of their list, and so the sequence begins. All sequences don't need to bow to the emerging future. To this day, we have email. We started out selling the Brain Audit in 2002, and the sequence went like this: subscriber, the Brain Audit, the membership at 5000 BC, etc. And has that sequence changed in over 2 decades? No, it hasn't, because there is no need to do so. We haven't felt the need to do so. We don't have any need to dominate the world like Apple, and our sequence has generated substantial ongoing revenue for over 20 years, which isn't to say that we'll never change. At times, a little tweak may determine a whole new world. With Apple, that tweak just happened to be AirPods. To their surprise and everybody else's, they've exceeded every expectation possible. All of our businesses should have some "You Are Here" signage for the client. They need to know where they are, where they're going. If things change, we can't bury our heads in the sand, because we need to change the sequence as well. If there is a sequence, there's also a clear way for the client to move forward. And this is the singular reason why we need to have a sequence, to implement it correctly and then change that if required. Make your business like an airport. Make sure that the client never gets lost. And of course, this brings us to the end of this sequence of 1, 2, 3. And what's the one thing that we can do here today? Well, I think it's the most obvious of all, is to sit down and work out what is the sequence that the client is going to follow. And that is the one most important thing that you can do. It's probably the thing that will determine where you go in the following year and the years to come, because the sequence lets you know what you have to do, lets the client know what they have to do. There is no downside to this, even if it's just a piece of paper. And once a year, we would create the sequence of what is to come. It was like the plan for the year, and we'd post it on 5000 BC and send it out to members. And it showed you where the courses were coming, what was happening, when. And I said would because we got lazy and we stopped doing it. And I think this year it's time for me to take my own advice and create that sequence so the clients know how to plan for the year to come. And that brings us to the end of this podcast, but let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics land. In a funny way, the whole writing of the sequence is a form of pre-sale. And pre-sale is where you are talking about something long before it happens. A lot of people think that they need to keep their products and services secret. I've run into photographers who are doing a shoot for a book, and they have to sign a non-disclosure agreement because they don't want anybody to know when the book is coming out or what's coming out in the book. And that's a mistake, because you want to let people know in bits and pieces what's coming out. It's like a wedding. You want this whole ramp up. When you look at movies, when you look at lots of books, when you look at lots of products and services, what's really happening is that they are pre-selling. There's an event happening next year, and it's only August or September of this year, and they are pre-selling the tickets, they're pre-selling the ideas, they're pre-selling everything. This is outlined in the series that we're offering, and that's on the 30th of November, which is pre-sale. It shows you exactly what you have to do and how you have to do it, because if you don't pre-sell, then all you have is a sales page and this big announcement around that sales date, and it doesn't work out as well as you think it should because you haven't done the pre-sale. So go to psychotactics.com, look for pre-sale, and there are goodies. These goodies are helpful all by themselves. So have a look and make sure that you're on the waiting list for the 30th of November, because that's the day it'll come out. Only the people on the waiting list get it. Have a look. And with that, I'll say bye for now. Bye-bye.